everyone, and welcome to my Voicethread presentation. My name is Andreas, and this video will be centered around the Taisho era during the years of 1912 to 1926. Compared to the Meiji era and the later Showa era, the Taisho is remarkably small, only lasting 14 years. However, even though the Taisho era is in the middle of two incredibly important eras in Japanese history, one should not consider the Taisho era as uneventful. Make no mistake, the Taisho era was not peaceful, as civil unrest sparked several violent riots and confrontations that was largely due to poverty and socio-economic injustices. However, what the Taisho era is most known for is the brief time of popularization of democracy and progressive thought in Japan, most commonly referred to as the Taisho democracy. There is a whole lot to cover regarding the social movements and rise of democracy within the Taisho era. I would like to dedicate this video to focus on the life of the emperor himself. Emperor Taisho is considered to be a rather anonymous emperor compared to Emperor Meiji and Emperor Showa. To provide an example for this, both Emperor Meiji's and Emperor Showa's birthdays are respectively celebrated as Altar Day on November 3rd and Greenery Day on April 29th. In contrast, Emperor Taisho's birthday on August 31st has become just short of forgotten. Who was Emperor Taisho? Why is his legacy not remembered as much? And why was his reign cut so short? Taisho Emperor, or Yoshihito as his birth name was born on August 31st, 1879. He was the third child of Emperor Meiji and the only survivor among his 14 other siblings. Just as the case of Emperor Meiji, Yoshihito's biological mother was not the empress, but an imperial concubine with the name of Yanagihara Naruko. To put it bluntly, Yoshihito was ill. Very shortly after his birth, he contracted what is now regarded as meningitis, an inflammatory swelling in the protective membranes covering the brain and the spinal cord. While he recovered from the disease, there are several contesting sources and reports regarding lingering implications, both physical and mental. Regardless, in 1887, Yoshihito attended the peer school and was actually the first heir to the throne to receive this kind of public education, studying various Western subjects as well as Chinese classics. During this time, Yoshihito officially became crown prince. He left school midway in 1894, whereas the reason for this is not entirely known. The popular conception regards this to be due to health issues. As he had turned 20 years old in 1890, he married the 15-year-old Kujo Sadako, which later would become Empress Teimei. During this time until Yoshihito ascended the throne 12 years later, he had three sons, Hirohito, Yasuhito, and Nobuhito. The youngest son Takahito was later born in 1915, 10 years after Nobuhito. Crown Prince Yoshihito, as a young adult, was a seemingly carefree person and exercised many freedoms, such as traveling around the country to such an extent that Emperor Meiji never did. Whereas other emperors' travel routes have been predetermined and certainly not planned for their own personal will, Yoshihito frequently traveled with relative freedom, visiting almost all of Japan's prefectures, and was not afraid to order a change of direction already while en route, which naturally caused some irritation among guarding police and other people involved. A small example, while on travel in Niigata, Yoshihito left his entourage in the prefectural assembly hall building without telling anyone to go for a walk. Naturally, panic ensued at the assembly hall and people began to frantically search for him. When he later was found, it is reported that he said something along the lines of, "What are you worried about? It was I who went off without telling anyone." There is another story where Yoshihito, during a visit to Itagi, Hyogo Prefecture, to review military exercises, paid a surprise visit to his former classmate. The classmate was taken by such a surprise and blurted out his overwhelming honor of being visited by his graciousness. Yoshihito replied by requesting his former classmate to loosen up and not to use such polite language with him. I think that these events that were mentioned tells us quite a bit about young Yoshihito's personal character, being quite carefree and youthful. That was a stark contrast to what typical emperor-like behavior would be. Unfortunately, I think that as Yoshihito ascended the throne in 1912 following the death of his father Emperor Meiji, Yoshihito's youthful nature would result in him having a difficult time adopting a life in the way of his father. The Minister of Home Affairs, Hara Takashi, also known for later establishing the first party cabinet in 1918, often met Yoshihito when he was still a crown prince. According to Hara's diary, Yoshihito is supposed to have said things along the lines of, "I'm very embarrassed by newspaper reports of my conduct. Emperor Meiji did things in his own way during his era, but I would like to keep them as simple as possible. I hate being accompanied by a large entourage." From these statements, we can quite certainly assume that Yoshihito did not prefer the ways in which his father did things as an emperor, and instead wanted to do things his way. However, things were easier said than done, and as Yoshihito ascended the throne as Emperor of Japan, he was still forced to abide by the ways of his father. As Emperor Yoshihito's physical and mental health gradually started to become weaker during his time of rule, some people will argue that his health degradation was due to the drastic life changes that were forced upon him as he took on the role of emperor. As a scholar by the name of Hara Takeshi puts it, "For someone who ascended the throne as a living god, Emperor Yoshihito was all too human." As Emperor Yoshihito reportedly became weaker and weaker as his years on the throne went by, word spread throughout the population, and common sentiment was developed that the emperor was physically frail and in some way mentally disturbed. There does not really exist any hard evidence regarding Emperor Yoshihito's mental health, whether this was in fact true, and if so, to what extent. Remember, the general knowledge of mental health 100 years ago was limited, to say the least. The most famous incident concerning the emperor that definitely did not help his public image was the time when, during an opening ceremony of the imperial diet, it was said that Emperor Yoshihito, after reading from a rescript, rolled up the papers and, just like with a telescope, peered across the audience. Whether this story is true or not, or if there was some context that was lost as the story was repeatedly retold, we don't know. The reason I'm telling you this story is to give you a hunch of how these rumors painted his image. In November 1921, Emperor Yoshihito went into retirement, reportedly to have been too sick to carry out his duties. While still keeping the title as emperor, his son, the Crown Prince Hirohito, took over the emperor's official affairs as regent. During the Great Kanto earthquake in 1923, where lost lives were estimated to have been a staggering 150 to 200,000, Emperor Yoshihito was fortunate enough to have gone to the Tomosawa Imperial Villa in Nikko and was physically unaffected by the earthquake. Emperor Yoshihito passed away on December 25, 1926, due to the complications of pneumonia, which ultimately caused a heart attack. Before his death, as his critical conditions was made public, people assembled outside the palace to pray for his recovery. I think it is important to realize a debate that is concerning the emperor's last years, from his retirement until his death. While the popular assumption is that Emperor Yoshihito was simply haunted by illness throughout his entire life, forcing him to give up his official duties to his son, there are other sources saying that there was a lot more behind the scenes. Remember that the time when Emperor Yoshihito sat on the throne was internationally a time when a lot of monarchies were replaced by republican forms of government, such as the case of Russia, Germany, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire. So the emperor's tendency to in a way downplay the imperial authority, as explained earlier, his degrading health, in addition to the increasing popularization of democratic thought in Japan, undoubtedly must have worried government leaders. The image of Emperor Meiji as the strong emperor who united the country was still fresh within many of them, and in these times, for them, a strong Meiji-like emperor was necessary. Emperor Yoshihito was too weak. Thus, installing his son Hirohito as regent and having him take over the official duties seemed like a good solution, in addition to making it public that the emperor was experienced diminished mental faculties as an after effect of brain injury as a child. With an announcement declaring the emperor to be essentially mentally disabled, it may have been easier for the population to accept this change of power to the crown prince. I think the story of the Taisho emperor is quite an unfortunate one, whether or not he was plagued by illness his entire life, or if this was only during his early and late periods of life. He stood in the shadow of the Meiji emperor, and an era that had experienced incredible change and development, and being pressured to adhere to the ways of being an emperor laid out by his father. Emperor Yoshihito was not able to do this and died quite early, and as his son, Hirohito, ascended the throne and the Showa era was officially initiated, the rule by a strong emperor thus resonated with many as a sort of re-establishment of the glorious old memory of Meiji, thus being a sort of interlude between two strong emperors in the mind of the population. The collective memory of the ill and short-lived Taisho emperor inevitably withered away. What do you think? Thanks for watching.